The padlock was still warm from the locksmith's truck when John Wayne drove past it. It was September 1959, and the garage sat at the edge of Elko, Nevada, on a stretch of US 93 where the sage flats went on long enough that a man could believe the world had forgotten that town existed. Dusty plate glass in the front window. A hand-painted sign above the bay doors that read Roper Auto and Machine, EST, 1946. The kind of shop that smelled of motor oil and old coffee, and something underneath both of those things, iron filings, maybe, or just the residue of years spent doing useful work in a world that didn't always notice. A man named Donald Roper had opened those bay doors for 13 years. He had come back from Korea in the winter of 1951, 1st Marine Division, attached to the 7th Regiment, Chosin Reservoir, November and December 1950. He had come back with most of his fingers, but not all of them. The two on his left hand that were missing he never discussed. He came home to Elko because it was where his father was, and because his father was sick, and because there was a half-paid building on US 93 that had been a tire shop before the war, and could be a garage again if a man was willing to spend 18 months turning it back into something. Donald Roper was willing. He spent 18 months. Then, he spent 13 years. He hired 2 men from the county over the course of those years. He fixed the trucks that kept the ranches running. He fixed the combines at harvest. He fixed the school district's 2 buses every August before the routes started. He did not ask for advance payment, and he did not ask for credit checks, and he did not keep the kind of books that made things complicated. A rancher who was short in November could make it right in January after the calves were sold. That was understood. That was how it had always worked on that road. The 2 men he hired were named Carson Webb and Abel Torres. Carson had a wife and 3 boys in a house a quarter-mile east. Abel had come up from Winnemucca with his tools in a canvas bag and a letter of reference from a garage there. Donald had given them both steady work for 9 and 6 years, respectively. The shop was not making anyone rich. It was making 3 families stable, and in Elko, Nevada, in 1959, that was the same thing. In August of that year, the First National Bank of Nevada sent a letter. The letter was 3 paragraphs long, and it was very polite. The commercial loan on the building, a balance of $6,200, remaining against original principal of $11,500, had been transferred to a regional collections desk as part of a portfolio review. The bank was restructuring its commercial exposure in Elko County. Under the revised terms, the outstanding balance was due in full within 60 days, or the bank would exercise its right to secure the collateral. The letter was signed by a man named Gerald Pitts, Assistant Vice President, Commercial Accounts. Donald Roper read the letter at his workbench on a Tuesday morning in August, and then set it down next to a carburetor he was cleaning, and kept cleaning. He had $1,040 in his business account. He had $380 in a personal savings account his father had started in 1938. He had the tools in the shop, and the shop itself, which he did not own unless he could come up with $6,200 in 60 days. He did not tell Carson or Abel. He called the bank in Reno. A woman named Mrs. Carlyle answered and transferred him to, who was very pleasant and explained that the decision had come from above his desk, and he was sorry for the difficulty, and he was sure Mr. Roper understood that the bank's obligations ran to its shareholders as well as its borrowers. Mr. Roper said he understood. He asked if there was any flexibility on the timeline. Gerald Pitts said he would see what he could do and would have an answer by Friday. Friday came, no call. The following Tuesday, Gerald Pitts appeared in person. He arrived in a clean Buick at 8 in the morning, and he had a younger man with him who carried a document case. Pitts wore a pressed shirt, and had the bearing of a man who had done difficult things before, and found that being pleasant about it made things go more smoothly for everyone. He sat across from Donald Roper at the workbench that served as Donald's office, and explained that the bank had reviewed the request for extended terms, and that unfortunately the decision had been made at a level above his desk, and the position remained unchanged. He said 60 days had become 30, due to the missed communication. Donald Roper sat very still. The younger man with the document case had not sat down. He stood near the bay door and looked at a point slightly above Donald's head. Gerald Pitts placed a receipt on the workbench. The receipt was for a locksmith company out of Wells. He said the bank had taken the liberty of securing the premises as of that morning, and he hoped Donald would understand that this was standard procedure and not personal, and that if Donald did need access to tools or personal belongings, arrangements could certainly be made through the bank's property management contact. Donald Roper looked at the padlock on the bay door he had built and he looked at the receipt, and he looked at Gerald Pitts. The receipt was dated that morning, September 4th, 1959. Outside on the road, Carson Webb had pulled up in his truck and was sitting behind the wheel, looking at the Buick and the padlock, and not getting out. Abel Torres had arrived on foot and was standing at the edge of the lot with his tool bag on his shoulder and his hat in his hand. Nobody was saying anything. In the lot across the road, a tan Stetson was visible above the roof of a dusty truck. The man under it had not gotten out of the truck. He was watching. Here is the story. Donald Roper had driven down to Elko from Winnemucca the year before to pick up a part he couldn't source closer. He had stopped at a diner on the edge of town to eat before driving back, and at the counter he had gotten to talking with a man in work clothes who was eating quietly and drinking black coffee, and didn't appear to be in any hurry. They talked for 40 minutes about roads and trucks and the state of ranching in northern Nevada and the cost of diesel the past 3 years. The man paid for Donald's lunch without mentioning it, until Donald reached for his wallet, and the man said, simply, "Already done." Donald said thank you, and the man said something about knowing what it meant to get somewhere you needed to be without spending what you couldn't spend. They shook hands, and Donald drove back to Elko. He had not recognized the man. He learned who it was 3 weeks later, when a rancher outside Elko mentioned having seen John Wayne at a roadside diner while Wayne was driving to a location shoot in Idaho. The rancher described the work clothes and the Stetson and said Wayne had been eating by himself, quiet as anything, just a working man at a counter, not making a point of it. Donald had thought about that for a day and then gone back to the carburetor he was cleaning and kept cleaning it. That was 1958. Now it was September 1959, and a different carburetor was on the bench, and the same kind of quiet had come over the lot, the frozen kind, where people stand at the edges of things and look at their hands and wait for something to resolve that they have decided is not their problem. Gerald Pitts was gathering his documents. The truck across the road had not moved. Then the door of the truck opened, and a man in a canvas jacket and a battered Stetson stepped out and walked across US 93 without looking either direction, because there was no traffic, and because the walk had a quality to it that suggested he was not thinking. He walked into the lot and past Carson Webb's truck and past Abel Torres, who took one step back without meaning to, and he walked to the bay door and looked at the padlock for a moment. Then he turned around and looked at Gerald Pitts. He said, "Who holds the paper?" Pitts said, "I'm sorry?" "The note." Pitts said that the note had been transferred to the bank's regional collections desk as part of a portfolio review, and that the number. Pitts said $6,200. The man in the canvas jacket turned and looked at Donald Roper for a moment. Not at Pitts. At Donald. Then he said to Pitts, I'll need a receipt. Pitts said, I'm not sure I understand what you mean. I'm going to count out $6,200 on the hood of your car, and you're going to write me a receipt that says the note is paid and that padlock comes off. He said it the way a man states a weather forecast, not because he is arguing about the weather, because the weather is the weather and arguing about it does not change it. Gerald Pitts looked at the man and then looked at the document case and then looked at the man again. Something moved across his face. Not shame. Not quite. The man in the canvas jacket had already turned to the truck. He came back with a canvas bag and set it on the hood of the Buick and began counting. He counted out loud. Slowly, in hundreds, then 50s, then 10s. The way a man counts who is accustomed to handling the kind of money that takes time to accumulate and does not take that for granted. When he reached $6,200, he stopped and looked at Pitts and said, "Receipt." Pitts wrote it on the bank because that was what he had. His hand was steady. He was that kind of man. The man in the canvas jacket folded the receipt once and put it in his jacket pocket. He picked up what was left in the canvas bag. Donald Roper would later estimate it was another $300 or $400 at least, and walked to where Donald was standing and held the canvas bag out to him. Donald said, "I can't take that." The man said, "You're not taking it. I ate for free at your counter in 1958, and I've been carrying that around." Donald said, "That wasn't and then stopped, because something in the other man's face said the conversation was already finished. Besides, the man said, that padlock should have come off before it went on. He looked at Gerald Pitts, who was already walking to his Buick. The younger man with the document case had not said a word the entire time. Pitts drove away, without looking back. Abel Torres was still standing at the edge of the lot with his hat in his hands. Carson Webb had gotten out of his truck and was standing next to it with his arms at his sides, looking at nothing in particular, blinking in the September light. The man in the canvas jacket walked to the padlock on the bay door and looked at it once more. He said, "You'll want a new locksmith." Something about the way that one charges for a job he shouldn't have had. Then he walked back across US 93 to his truck and drove north. Donald Roper stood in the lot for a long time. He had the canvas bag in his hand. He read the receipt Pitts had left. He read it again. Carson Webb said, "Was that?" Donald said, "Go ahead and get the bay doors open." Have you ever stood in a lot watching someone lose something they spent a decade building and had nothing in your hands to stop it? Drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. Donald Roper paid off the original banknote in full. The money from the canvas bag covered 2.5 months of operating costs and a new hydraulic press he had been pricing for. He kept the shop open on US 93 for 22 more years after that September. He retired in 1981. By then, the shop had fixed somewhere in the range of 14,000 vehicles. By Carson Webb's rough accounting, he had kept a logbook starting in 1961 because he said he liked to know. Carson's youngest son, Dale Webb, started working at the shop in 1973 when he was 17. He learned the trade from Donald. When Donald retired, Dale bought the tools and the lease and ran the shop until 1994 under the same name, because Donald asked him to and Dale saw no reason not to. Roper Auto and Machine, EST 1946, same sign, same bay doors. The lettering had been repainted twice by then. Abel Torres left the shop in 1966 when his father's health declined and he needed to return to Winnemucca. He came back through Elko in the winter of 1969 with his wife and 2 daughters and found work at a different shop in town. He stopped by Roper Auto on a Thursday in January of that year, and Donald gave him a day's work and lunch, and they talked about the roads and the cost of diesel. the same way they always had. Abel's daughter, Marisol, graduated from the University of Nevada in 1983 with a degree in civil engineering. She built things for the state for 31 years. Donald Roper did not learn the man's name until November of 1959, when a neighbor drove out to the shop specifically to show him a magazine photograph of publicity still from a studio release. The man in costume this time. Not canvas. A different kind of hat, and asked if Donald had heard that John Wayne had been through Elko in the fall. Donald looked at the photograph for a moment. He said he hadn't. The receipt from First National Bank of Nevada, dated September 4th, 1959, signed by Gerald Pitts, Assistant Vice President, Commercial Accounts, with the words paid in full written across it, in Pitts's own careful hand. That receipt sat in a cigar box on the workbench for 22 years. When Donald retired, Dale Webb found it while cleaning. He put it in a frame and hung it on the wall of the office, which had been the same workbench for 35 years by then. It hung there until the shop closed in 1994. The frame was plain wood, unpainted. The receipt had gone the color of old newsprint by then, and the afternoon light coming through the window made the ink on it almost golden. That is what Donald Roper left. 22 years of bay doors open on US 93. 3 families, 14,000 vehicles, give or take. A son who learned a trade that outlasted the shop. An engineer in Reno who grew up knowing that her father had steady work because a stranger had counted cash on the hood of a Buick on a September morning and then driven north. John Wayne never spoke of it, not to his director, not to his co-stars on the set in Idaho, not in any interview, not in any letter anyone ever found. It was not a story he told. It was not something he needed anyone to know about. There is a kind of man who notices the people that a room has decided not to see, who looks at a padlock on a bay door and understands exactly what it cost to build what's behind it, who counts out cash on the hood of a car and calls it a debt he owes, because calling it anything else would take something from the man receiving it, and he is not in the business of taking things from people who have already had enough taken. That kind of man does not require an audience. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There are more stories like this one, and every one of them deserves to be told. And unfortunately, they don't make men like John Wayne anymore.